Hello, historians. It is January 6th, 2022. We are going to just take a quick look, an overview of the 19th and 20th centuries. We'll be talking a lot more of those when we get back in class together. We can talk in person and discuss things, but today you get a video lecture. If there were any assignments, I want to mention that any of the assignments that I had pushed all back to be due today. Okay, if you have yours in a form that you can email it to me, then just go ahead and do that. If you hand wrote it and you don't have a way to scan it or whatever, you can always bring it the next time, whenever that is that we meet in person, and do it then. I was hoping we'd be able to see each other, but today you just get to see me. Sorry about that. But so I just want to look at some of the things that are going on. First of all, in the 19th century, which is of course the 1800s, one of the things is technology. Technology is growing by leaps and bounds. The next class will be talking a lot about the technology of the time. In 1832, Samuel Morse patents the telegraph, and the telegraph comes into wide usage in the early 1800s. He actually thought of it as he was returning on a ship studying art in Europe. He got this idea of an electric telegraph because he heard a conversation about this newly discovered thing called an electromagnet. And he put the idea forward in 1753, and there had already been some electric telegraphs sending messages short distances for a while, but Morse thought that his was the first proposal, and his first working model probably was made in 1835. And by 1838, he and his friend, Alfred Vail, developed what we now call Morse code, the system of dots and dashes that allow you to communicate via a telegraph when they just tap on the telegraph. Another thing that's happening during this period is the first Opium War, which goes from 1839 to 1842, and it's between Britain and China because Great Britain has been over-importing opium to China, and opium is a very addictive drug. People don't know a lot about addiction in this period of time, but China's like, stop bringing that into this country, and they actually went to war with Great Britain over that. In 1840, Lower and Upper Canada were united in what was called the Union Act of 1840, and Canada was divided into the lower and upper provinces, and there was a rebellion that took place in 1837 as citizens protested for more democratic reforms, like what's happening, their neighbor to the south, the United States. And so the British Prime Minister sends an official to British North America to see what's going on, and the report recommended that they unify Lower and Upper Canada all into one province called Canada. And but actually that was not all of Canada. There were still provinces that weren't part of that. It took nearly 20 years before Parliament would include the rest of their colonies and the colonies that they got from France. So it'd be 1867, the British North America Act creates a unified Canada, including Quebec, the French-speaking colony. So in 1842, another technology thing, Crawford Long, a doctor, used ether as an anesthetic for the first time. He was an American surgeon and pharmacist, and he had first used inhaled sulfuric ether as an anesthetic, but he never really wrote about it. He never patented, he didn't publish. And so there later will be a controversy over who really did it first. But the consensus is that it was actually this guy, Crawford Long, who just didn't publicize what he was doing. By 1844, the Chinese and the British are getting along a little better, and so China opens up their ports to more people, including to the U.S. 5 Chinese ports are open to the U.S., and this leads to China becoming quite an exporter of goods as they have more international shipping happening. They kind of, this sort of small, not small, it's never been small, but this unnoticed backwater kind of a country becomes much more visible through all this growth and importation. In literature, Edgar Allan Poe writes The Raven. You might know the line, quoth the raven nevermore, in 1845. In 1846, Elias Howe patents something very new at the time, but something people still use to this day, and that's a sewing machine. We also have in 1846 the failure of the potato crop in Ireland. They believe that some kind of fungus infected the potato crop, and basically the potatoes just were never maturing, and potato was a staple food, especially in the country of Ireland. And so we have this famine in Ireland where people are literally starving to death because they have nothing to eat. Now, Ireland is part of the British Empire right now, and they call it in Ireland, they call it the Great Hunger. And 3/4 of the crop was lost over 7 years. And the tenant farmers, the land was all owned by Great Britain, and tenant farmers worked the land, and potato was their main source of food. And so this it was a catastrophe in Ireland. And just the people were, like I said, literally starving to death. And literally 1 million Irish people died from starvation. And it forced another 1 million to leave Ireland as refugees. This has a big impact on the United States. A lot of these Irish people come to the U.S. The U.S. is still pretty open for immigrants to come in. They haven't started forbidding, the Chinese or the Irish or any of these groups of people at this time. So many, many Irish come to the United States, and so Ireland gives birth to a large section of the population in, especially the Northeast, later the South, and eventually everything will move west in the 1840s. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then in 1848, there is another revolt in Paris, and King Louis Philippe abdicates the throne. He gives up his throne, and a relative of someone we've talked about before, a guy named Louis Napoleon, same family, he's elected president of the French Republic. In 1848, that particular year is sometimes called the Springtime of the Peoples, or it's called the Springtime of Nations, because there were a series of political upheavals throughout Europe in 1848. It remains the most widespread revolutionary wave in European history. The revolutions were essentially democratic. People wanted democratic rule, and the aim was to get rid of the old monarchy structures, create independent nation states. So the revolution spread across Europe, with the initial beginning in France in February, and 50 countries were affected. Even though there wasn't like any cooperation or coordination or anything like that between these countries, they all are having these revolutions. And some of the contributing factors are there's dissatisfaction with political leadership. There is demands for more participation in government and democracy. There is demand for freedom of the press. Demands are made by the working class for more economic rights. We also see an upsurge in nationalism. Like, people begin to really identify as, I am a citizen of this nation and that matters to me. We'll see ramifications of that later in the United States when, the Irish and the Italians don't like each other. They're living in the same areas, they're working the same jobs, but they don't like each other. So my husband's grandparents were in that situation when they came over from Sicily, and the Irish had gotten there first, and so their work in the mine. I think I've told you the story. Pennsylvania had a law that required you to have an Irish name to work in the mines, but the mines needed miners badly. So basically, you came in, they're like, "Oh yeah, you're Mr. O'Neill today, Mr. whatever your Sicilian last name is, Mr. Montanti, or, whatever it is. And so we see this growth and leaving of countries because of these revolutions in some ways. People go into exile. But many of the revolutions were suppressed quickly, and tens of thousands of people were killed, many forced into exile. But there were some significant lasting reforms as a result of these revolutions in 1848. One was that they abolished their feudal system. They got rid of having, serfs in Austria and Hungary, which will eventually become the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But for now, they basically allow people to own their own land and work their own land, and they don't have to live, under the rule of the landowner. They don't belong to the land anymore. And we see the end of absolute monarchy in Denmark and the introduction of representative democracy in the Netherlands. The revolutions were most important in France, the Netherlands, Italy, the Austrian Empire, the Austro-Hungary Empire, and the states of the German Federation. Okay, these German states would come to make up the German Empire in the late 19th and early 20th century. Also in 1848, a U.S. treaty with Britain sets the Oregon Territory northern boundary. It's at the 49th parallel. That's the border where the Oregon Territory would meet what was then British Canada, but that will change over time. But right now we see the Oregon Territory officially set. In 1848, two guys by the name of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels published the Communist Manifesto. And the Communist Manifesto is basically a pamphlet that is written to explain the platform of the Communist League political group. It becomes one of the principal guiding statements of European socialism and communism in the 19th and early 20th centuries. So in 1849, you may have heard about the 49ers, not the football team, but the guys who headed west because of the California Gold Rush. Like, that's U.S. history, Mrs. Bonfanti. Why are we talking about U.S. history? Well, first of all, the California Gold Rush begins and radically transforms California, of course, but also the United States and even the world. The Gold Rush takes place against the backdrop of the Industrial Revolution, and it serves as a source of economic growth, economic development for the 19th century all over the world. And the influx of gold results in the expansion of manufacturing and service industries. And entrepreneurs get rich by taking advantage of the demand for mining materials. They often usually got richer than the miners themselves by selling things to the miners that they need. The devices that you need to mine, the lumber, the clothing, the transportation. I said they got richer than most miners did. And then businesses boomed during the gold rush because people have money to spend. Some people, not all people. But it leads California to become a global economic powerhouse and a much desired immigrant destination by the end of the century. And some of today's most recognizable brands, even today, began during the gold rush. Businesses and icons that get their start, like two guys, a guy named Henry Wells and William Fargo, saw that there was an opportunity to provide financial service to the gold seekers, and so they started a bank called Wells Fargo and Company. Some of your families may still bank with Wells Fargo today. Obviously, it's still a huge banking business, exists all over the world and in the United States. Another guy who was a pretty smart guy, let me check something here. Okay. Do I have any? No. Okay, I was seeing if I have rivets on my jeans. So this one guy, he's a German immigrant, come to the United States because of the gold rush, and he realizes that miners need better clothing, sturdier clothing. And so he creates these canvas pants where all of the pressure points on the pants where they're likely to tear are riveted. They put a little metal rivet on those weaker points, and that way they could just withstand, you know, these long working hours involved in gold mining. And this guy, this German immigrant who came up with these riveted pants, whose name was Levi Strauss. And obviously you probably have heard of him, and you may even own some Levi's in your life, as that company is still successful in producing denim and other types of clothing. Another American humorist came west and discovered he didn't like mining much, but that he was pretty good at writing, and he became a reporter, and his name was Samuel Clemens, and we of course know him as Mark Twain, who will write eventually Huckleberry Finn, the great American novel, and Tom Sawyer, and you know, other books like The Jumping Frog of Calaveras County, and a number of great books. He would also go on to be the editor of Ulysses S. Grant's biography. So Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens, became who we know him as, a writer of stories during the gold rush. In 1851, Herman Melville publishes Moby Dick. If you haven't read that, you'll probably be forced to read it at some point in your school career. It's actually a very, it's like a little like Tale of Two Cities in that it's tough to read, but I think it's a little easier to read than Tale of Two Cities. So the South African Republic is established. Why is the South African Republic established? Well, two things are discovered in South Africa. Excuse me, my nose is itchy. One of them is gold, and the other one is diamonds. Diamond mines are established in South Africa, and that becomes the push to it becoming its own nation and a republic. Louis Napoleon in France, another one of these Napoleons, proclaims himself Napoleon III in 1852 and wants to lead France. We'll get more into that later. Harriet Beecher Stowe writes a book, a novel called Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it's published in 1852, and it becomes the initial push for many people to begin their opposition of slavery. It actually had a very deep impact on a lot of people and their view of slavery, and so it's one of the first steps towards the Civil War and the eventual abolition of slavery. We've already talked about the Crimean War, when Turkey declares war on Russia, and we remember Florence Nightingale invented modern day nursing during the Crimean War. A lot of great literature was written during the Crimean War. I think we've already looked at The Charge of the Light Brigade. If we haven't, we will soon. Thoreau publishes Walden Pond, or On Walden Pond, which is one of the most influential books of American literature for a very long time. In a great mutiny, also called the Sepoy Rebellion, begins in India, and India is placed under the direct rule of the Queen of England at this point. They are no longer under the rule of Parliament. They have no home rule. It's all British rule, and that will remain that way actually until Gandhi comes along in the 20th century and leads a passive revolution, a bloodless revolution. In 1859, work begins on a major architectural project called the Suez Canal. The canal is a waterway running across North and South Egypt, in the Isthmus of Suez, I forget where that Suez came in, which will connect the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. And the canal separates the African continent from Asia and provides the shortest sea route between Europe and the lands lying around the Indian and Western Pacific Oceans. And it's now, still to this day, one of the world's most heavily used shipping lanes. And also this year, the unification of Italy begins. A guy named Jean-Joseph Etienne Lenoir builds the first practical internal combustion engine in 1860. And in 1860, Charles Darwin's Origin of the Species and All of Its Controversy is published. 1861, serfs are set free in Russia. Louis Pasteur publishes his theory on germs. It leads to the process of pasteurization, where things are heated to kill germs. It's why we have pasteurized milk to this day, and it led to a lot of people not getting sick, not dying from parasites, and germs and such that were in milk at the time. I'm sorry. So in France, the Third Republic is proclaimed, and a year later, France is still in turmoil, still weak, but they end up giving back this piece of territory called Alsace and Lorraine, which is France is here and Germany is here, and they've been fighting forever over this piece. And so France says to Germany, you can have it, we're not fighting with you anymore. Little did they know. And the German Empire is proclaimed with the Prussian king, Kaiser Wilhelm I, becomes the leader. 1872, Jules Verne, Around the World in 80 Days is published. Alexander Graham Bell patents the telephone in 1876. And I'm going to stop there for today. And next class we will continue. I'll have to mark on my paper how far I got. Hopefully we'll see you on Tuesday. If not, I'll let you know about the video. I hope you got the copy of the homework and what's due today and what's due. I'm trying to remember if does history have something due today? You need to look on your paper because I don't have it in front of me. But everything that was due today, if you can't get it to me today, as soon as we see each other in person. Otherwise, email it to me if you can. And that's it. Bye for now.